We'll now move to our final round of speeches, starting with Irfan Nooruddin. Irfan is a professor at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and is a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, also in Washington, D.C. Irfan, the floor is yours.
Good evening, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen of the House. The proposition before us is the end is nigh for American supremacy. To agree, as I hope you will, does not require that we suggest that America has never been the global hegemon. It does not require that we believe that all things American have been bad. It does not require that we believe that America today has collapsed under its own weight. It merely requires that we demonstrate that the age of American imperialism, the age of American unquestioned dominance over the global order that it created in the aftermath of World War II is nigh, it's over. In fact, if there was anything in the proposition that I would disagree with, it is maybe the proposition that it is nigh. In fact, I would argue that we are here not to ask a prospective question, but to perform a postmortem on American supremacy. That the real questions at hand are when did it end and why? So a few days before the US election, it is very tempting simply to point to the caricature of xenophobic bombast that masquerades as American exceptionalism as prima facie evidence in favor of the proposition. But to do so is to afford the current occupant of the White House, he who shall not be named, and all his enablers a much greater power than they warrant. The current president is not the last emperor, but rather the culmination, as my honorable colleague early on said, the culmination, a symptom of the slow erosion of American visionary leadership that created a unique global order in the aftermath of the Second World War. Indeed, if I were forced to provide a date of death for this coroner's report, I would argue that we should be looking at February 5th, 2003. But let's not start there. I will explain why in a little bit. Empires, even those that promise a 1,000-year reign or those that believe that the sun shall never set on them, are mortal, and the American empire is no exception. But even as I argue that we should be here this evening to pay our respects to that American empire, I'm also here to praise the remarkable feat of a global multilateral order founded on American principles and American values, undergirded by American generosity, of contributions of economic and military might that kept the world safe, that defended American liberty and freedoms and those values that are universal against communist dictatorship and totalitarianism. But even today, as my learned opponents have repeated often, even now, there is no country richer nor more powerful than the United States. But one must not confuse brute strength with leadership. To do so is to make a mistake that even a school child who has ever confronted a playground bully knows not to make. It is in fact a rare and unfortunate tendency of those who defend America that they both speak of these universal values and speak in the same breath as my respected opponent did at the opening, with such contempt for countries like Belgium, like Cuba, like those other countries like Switzerland. I might remind Mr. Gorka that Hungarian patriots were not the only ones who fought and suffered under Nazi occupation. Belgian patriots did as well. And even more, yes, it is true that America might have the nuclear capabilities to blow the world to smithereens many times over, but so does Putin's Russia. And no one is confusing that failed society for a global hegemon today. So what happened? How do we go from 1945 and the birth of the second half of an American century that is unprecedented in human history to where we are today? I do want to make the point. What America managed to do in the 50 years after World War II was create a sphere of influence that reached across the globe in a way that no other aspirant to international leadership has ever been able to do. Not even the British Empire, if I may, at the height of its power, enjoyed the breadth of influence that the Americans did in the 1960s and 1970s. They did this, as my colleague earlier said, by creating a web of international multilateral institutions founded on the principles of the rule of law that has never been seen ever before. The Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, countless conventions that governed everything from the laws of the sea to climate, to the way we protect endangered species. American influence, legal acumen, and money underpin those institutions. It is not a surprise that a great many of those institutions have headquarters not far from where I sit today in Washington, DC, or in New York City. But what we have seen since the end of the Cold War is an America that grew bored with its international leadership function. To be mean, it's an American tendency that eventually you want to change the channel. You grow bored. And America in the 1990s, in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, drunk its own Kool-Aid, to use a uniquely American phrase. It fell in love with its own hype. It believed, in fact, that it was the indispensable nation, that the world could not imagine a future that did not involve America at the very, very center of it. In the 1970s, a reporter asked John Lennon why he lived in New York City. And Mr. Lennon is reported to have said, if I'd lived during the age of the Roman Empire, I would have lived in Rome. I live in the 1970s, I live in New York City, right? The American Empire. It's an open question whether the same answer would be given today. For me, the date February 5th, 2003, recognizing that many of the members of the House today might have still been in nappies, is a critical date for understanding what happened. On 9/11, September 11, 2001, the United States was attacked by terrorists that brought down the World Trade Towers. It attacked the Pentagon and killed innocent lives in airplanes in fields in Pennsylvania. All over the world, there was a groundswell of support that was unanimous. We felt the pain of the American people at that terrible moment. A year later, that was squandered when Secretary of State Colin Powell went before the United Nations, presented evidence that his own staffers had suggested was dubious at best, fraudulent at worst, to make the case for an invasion of Iraq. America then announced the coalition of the willing and invaded Iraq, backed by a flotilla of island nations, the United Kingdom, Australia, the Solomon Islands, Marshall Islands, Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, 49 states, many of whom did not even own or possess an army. The president of the Solomon Islands was so surprised that to be part of the coalition willing, that he then asked to be taken off, as did Costa Rica. Can you imagine that we're talking about a global hegemon, the most powerful nation of the world, reduced to building a coalition of the willing among a set of nations, many of whom did not have their own militaries, and several of whom were surprised to know that they were in fact members of that coalition. It was as powerful a moment at which we realized that the emperor no longer wore any clothes, even if the rest of us were too polite to make this point. So here we are now, 2 decades later, countless lives lost, brave soldiers, American, British, and others of this multinational force trying to bring peace to Afghanistan and to Iraq. And we are faced with an image of American negotiators standing alongside Taliban negotiators, putting pressure on a legitimate democratically elected Afghan government to accept peace with the Taliban, even if this might mean sacrificing rights for women, girls, religious minorities, so that the United States president can announce a peace deal and holding a promise to bring American troops home. If that, my friends, is American supremacy, well, if you believe that's American supremacy, you should vote against this proposition. But there is no part of the American supremacy of the 1950s and 1960s of the leadership of General Eisenhower, of President Kennedy, even of Ronald Reagan, that would recognize in what is happening in Doha today as being evidence of American supremacy. In the minute I have left, I want to just talk about immigration. Several of my colleagues have talked about it, and every part of the American fiber believes that what makes America great is its openness to young people, old people, the persecuted from around the world. And yet, right now, we have a moment in which those in power mock the words that are inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, in which there are cages of children, 345 children separated from their parents, and the US government has no idea where those parents are. Children orphaned by a cruel, inhumane policy that threatens to cut off from America the very lifeblood of its success over the last 70 years. None of this proposition requires that we identify a successor. It is very tempting for the opposition to point to the flaws of China. I am not suggesting in my argument that China is a natural successor. I'm not suggesting that the 21st century will be a Chinese century. In fact, the history of the world suggests that what America did over the last 50 years was anomalous, that large parts of our future are going to be dominated by regional powers, and that hopefully, as we grapple with the climate change crisis that befalls your generation and those that will come later, that international cooperation will occur. Such cooperation will require leadership. And if any of you truly believe that that leadership on climate change is likely to come from the United States in 2020 and beyond, you should vote against this proposition. But I do not think that's the case, and I do not believe that you do either. And so I ask you, my friends, to vote with me in favor of the proposition that the end is nigh for American democracy and for American supremacy. Thank you very much.